Yes, love's a secret weapon. Yeah!
Hi, I'm Donna Loren.
And I'm Dr. Adam Gerace.
And you are listening to Love's a Secret Weapon podcast.
Okay, ready?
It only hurts when I cry. It only hurts when I cry.
Go, Donna!
You asked me if I ever longed for him since we said goodbye. Sure, I get sad, but it's not too bad. It only hurts when I cry. You see, I hardly even think of him as time goes slowly by. I just go on, there's nothing wrong. It only hurts when I cry. Sure, I remember our first kiss, the way I loved him then. Sometimes I think a love like this could never happen again. So please don't worry if I sigh for him. You know that I'll get by. I'll just pretend it's not the end. It only hurts when I cry. 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 Sure, I remember our first kiss, the way I loved him then. Sometimes I think a love like this could never happen again. So please don't worry if I sigh for him. You know that I'll get by. I'll just pretend that it's not the end. It only hurts when I cry. It only hurts when I cry. It only hurts when I cry. It only hurts when I
Welcome back to our podcast and our second episode of 2021. And today we're going to take a deep dive into a whole range of things, but primarily, or to begin with, beach blanket bingo. So Donna, how are you doing?
Oh, we are doing extremely well under this crazy experience of resiliency on the planet here, after the election and now the inauguration of our new president in the United States. I think people are just bouncing off the walls, even though there was an insurrection and there's an impeachment trial and God knows what. But
Well, it's all peaks and valleys, isn't it, really? But it's been quite a couple of weeks and, even longer than that. And, of course, we're having a bit of a heat wave here where I am in Australia. Luckily, there's also been a really weird weather event of a downpour. So a lot of the fires that had started up in the hills are hopefully getting under control. But you're kind of in the opposite end of it.
We're in the snow, yes.
We're in the snow.
We're in the absolutely gorgeous mountains above Palm Springs. And it's just my favorite time of year. There's a fragrance in the air that combines the sand in the desert with the snow on the mountains, and it's never been bottled. Tom Ford, what is your problem? This is like whatever Yves Saint Laurent did, with opium. This fragrance is, it's almost orgasmic. It just gets to the core of
wow.
being. Yeah, it's the elements. It's like the earth and the sky meet, and then the water that's frozen, and it's, it's all very, very interesting that, makes you feel alive. Not quite as alive as like Frankenstein's bride when she looks like she stuck her finger in the electric socket, but good old Elsa Lancaster,
Oh my God!
I
Yes,
got
of
to meet
course.
her. I got to meet her.
Absolutely, in one of the beach party films. You know, I'm sure she looked much more well put together than she did. Not, I mean, she looked fantastic in Frankenstein, but like you said, well, I'm sure a lovely woman nonetheless. And I'm thinking of, these fragrances. That's actually a good idea. I remember my friend used to get, Marc Jacobs had a line of fragrances, stuff like cucumber and grass and cotton and ivy and violet. And I can't remember, I'm pretty sure he got almost all of them. But yeah, if anyone's listening,
Come to the desert. Come to the desert now, where there's snow on the mountains, and you'll know what I mean.
This is probably a good sort of segue into what we're talking about today, because we're going to be talking about the beach and hot weather. But as we know from previous discussion of some of the other beach party movies, is that often these films, or probably always these films, were not filmed during summer, were they?
No, they disguised the goosebumps on everybody, and those, I guess people that are professional surfers, maybe they don't need wetsuits. I think many of them do, and especially now with the pollution in the oceans, they wear it for protection, other than just the cold. But the surfers that were in the films, of course there were sunny days, but it was more chilly, and they're athletic. So, I guess they just know how to weather that. And, go into 60 whatever degrees water, and well, it's a religion for surfers. I think that's actually, at the time those beach party movies were being made, it still hadn't been trendy. It was still kind of a cultish activity or practice among people that love surfing, going back to the Duke of Hanamoko. But the idea that riding a wave and just surrendering, to the force of nature, and then turning it into an art form, and becoming champions like Mickey Dora and Johnny Fane in the beach party movies. They're like the Rudolph Nureyevs of the ocean.
That's a good way of putting it, I think. And how cool that, these beach party films that, weren't always a lot about surfing, but certainly Bill Asher and AIP populated these movies with the surf guys and the surf girls. And you get to, for, aficionados of surfing, or that, time, that sort of mid-century period, to see people like Mickey Dora and Johnny Fane, dancing on the sand is pretty cool.
Yeah. And then, of course, I just have to take a tiny step before I got involved making movies. That Gidget, that was a real wake-up call, and California Dreamin', and, just the whole beyond Hollywood, it was like the 30s kind of created that Hollywood dreamland of people, wanted to be part of all over the world. But something got triggered, about Malibu and the West Coast, between the films and surfing and the music coming from the West Coast, that just, it just was like a triple threat. And AIP, which is the company that, was behind it all. Samuel Arkoff, who was a really, really lovely man, and his partner, James Nicholson, just took this, they just, somehow they got really, really fortunate, and and then America's Sweetheart, and Philadelphia Prince, became together.
Absolutely.
Lots of magic happening.
When we think about that, yeah, just that idea of all this stuff coming out of the West Coast, the fact that AIP, American International Pictures, were such experts on, the creation and the promotion side of this California dream, where many people who were watching these in drive-in theaters or, normal cinemas were taken somewhere that they might have not experienced in their daily lives, living in, some sort of landlocked state somewhere.
And didn't it affect, the Australian coastline, for surfers, or, didn't it become an international craze at the time?
Absolutely. I mean, those movies and that whole movement that began with them or existed, coincide with them, because of course, we're a beach nation here. It was a very impactful series of films, as well as the whole surf culture here being, as big as it is. Certainly those movies and the music, around that time, whether it was the Beach Boys, whether it was, the Sun Rays, I Live for the Sun, they were all big hits here, because I think they were tapping into something that, perhaps we particularly relate to over here, being so close to the beach. I mean, I'm a 10-minute drive from the beach, and we often go walking there at night or let Lucy off her leash to, frolic in the sand, and then, come home and need to be put in the bathtub. But it's pretty magical stuff. And just before we start, because I think we're going to talk a lot about not only Beach Blanket Bingo, the film, but also the album and working with, in California, the Wrecking Crew, but just to talk about the idea of this whole thing about the weather and filming during, the cold. Found a cool little excerpt from, I think this was an interview that Sally Saxer, who was one of the Beach Girls, gave to a website called Cinema Metro, and it was talking about filming late in the afternoon. And she said here, she goes, "It was really chilly and we were fighting the light. Wrapped in terry cloth robes, a group of us huddled together to keep warm. Carl, the prop man, handed us a bottle of brandy. We were surprised when Annette took a couple of swigs. She got a bit tipsy and was clowning around. It was the only time I ever saw her let herself go wild." So there you go.
Well, sorry, but my restriction was Dr. Pepper.
Not even Irishing it up. No, that wasn't the way it went.
No.
No, definitely not.
Strictly effervescence for me.
Well, on that note, why don't we get into Beach Blanket Bingo? So will you read for us, Donna?
I'd love to. Culminating 1964, we began shooting Beach Blanket Bingo. We filmed primarily at Leo Carrillo Beach, which is the most northern end of Malibu. This historic site can also be seen in Gidget, in Grease, The Karate Kid, and Inception. Frankie and Annette, John Ashley, and Deborah Wally were the stars of the film. What you see is what you get. The personas that they portrayed were actually how they were off screen. In fact, I dare say that all of us were just being ourselves, with the exception of Bobby Shaw, who always was sweet, but had a much bigger vocabulary than ya. One day in the makeup room, I walked in on Annette, who welcomed me. She began to explain why her face was so red. "Last night, I fell asleep under a sun lamp," Annette humbly said. "My face feels like a roasted marshmallow." The makeup man began patting her face with some kind of makeup to lighten the color of her skin. As he applied the creamy substance, her delicate skin revealed blisters. They were popping and oozing down her cheeks, and she was so humiliated as I watched her discomfort. She made gestures that she was only trying to look the part of a beach girl, but her fair Italian complexion never liked the sun. Therefore, she tried a sun lamp. Now she had blistered her face, and it was all red. I waited to see what condition she was in and helped her smile with her dilemma. "You're so beautiful," I told her. "No one will ever know the difference once you're in front of the cameras." It took 2 hours for her makeup to be applied and not endanger her skin with infection. The redness was gone, and the makeup camouflaged any unevenness caused by the blistering. She only exposed her face, thank goodness, so the rest of her was fine. Well, much more than fine. My signature song, It Only Hurts When I Cry, was set in sort of an ironic situation. Here I was singing a romantic ballad with an upbeat tempo written especially for me for the film. While I'm singing my heart out, Ned Wynn, whose father Keenan Wynn, who had starred in Pajama Party, began strumming a guitar while I was unconsciously holding a hot dog on a stick in a mid-century modern fireplace. Mike Nader, later of All My Children fame, had a good laugh at the end of my song, and so did surfing legends Mickey Dora and Johnny Fain when they saw the burnt weenie. Go, Donna! Sensing that there was a hit movie looming in the near future, my label, Capitol Records, rushed me into their studio on Vine Street and hired H.B. Barnum to arrange my album. All the songs written by Guy Hemrick and Jerry Steiner, including It Only Hurts When I Cry, as well as Cycle Set by Gary Usher and Roger Christian, were now on my soundtrack for the film. Oh, and by the way, I have to say that my producer was David Axelrod. The album ended with a song by Mike Curb called Freeway. On December 29th at 11 a.m., we began recording the Beach Blanket Bingo album for 14 hours straight. We cranked out song after song, generally getting it in the first take or two after minimal rehearsal. At 2 a.m, it was playback time in the Capitol Tower. I had sung all day with the top musicians in town, the Wrecking Crew, Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kay on bass, Tommy Tedesco on guitar, Leon Russell on keyboards, and Glenn Campbell on lead guitar. Mr. Barnum wore a silk suit and looked just as neat and tidy at 2 a.m. as he did when he started at 11 a.m. in the morning before. Except for one little detail. We made an album in one day. We listened back to every song, and my eyes wandered. First, I saw a sign on the wall of the control booth where the sound engineer sits. It was a union sign stating, "No miner shall work more than 4 hours in any given day." Well, that rule was broken. I was a miner, and we had exceeded the limit by 10 hours. Nobody cared. I was entrenched by my career and family obligations. The second thing my eye caught was a spot on Mr. Barnum's suit. More specifically, his trousers. What? He squirted a little excitement while listening to the playback. Major accomplishment. An orgasm? Wow. It was that good? Cool. Well, secretly, it made me happy to see his reaction. Of course, not a word or acknowledgement of this pleasure was expressed by moi until now. He's my flyboy. Actually, recently I received salutations from him via the grapevine. You know, he was Aretha Franklin's musical director. I must admit, this recollection in retrospect I now interpret in the manner I am expressing. Notes from my diary in Mom's handwriting. Released Beach Blanket Bingo album on Wednesday, April 7th. The following Wednesday, April 14th, Beach Blanket Bingo, the movie, opened in 465 theaters.
Wow, there's a lot to talk about there. I'll start with the performance of what's become your signature song, It Only Hurts When I Cry, in the film. Tell me about working with, I presume it was Al Sims, the musical director at AIP, on the arrangement for the film version of It Only Hurts When I Cry.
I really wasn't involved in much other than the performance.
Sure.
First of all, the music in films is usually timed because of a scene and the sequence. So I'm sure that was a consideration for the way that they produced the song.
Sure.
I was not included, in discussing the tempo, or the only thing that I was involved in was making sure that I was singing in the key that, of course, was the best for me. Yeah. And I think that generally, if a guy like H.B. Barnum is in charge, there's no micromanaging, I mean, you've got a guy like David Axelrod at the helm producing, and H.B. Barnum arranging, and the musicians that are all A-list musicians.
Absolutely.
And so I think that I walked into Capitol Towers studio.
Yeah.
Same studio, Studio A, where Frank Sinatra recorded. And and I had a lot of confidence. It wasn't really thought out, like beyond me just getting acquainted with the material.
Yeah.
And for the musicians to be booked and hired, and to play for all those hours, is quite unusual, because my experience is a 3-hour session.
Yeah.
That's kind of the norm, where you book a date for 3 hours. That's pretty much the longevity,
Well, yeah, absolutely.
of a musician and an artist.
Yeah.
And I think we spoke about Sinatra. I mean, he would be well rehearsed before he walked in the studio. Musicians better be ready. And he walked in, take one, gone.
Yeah.
Although he might have done more than one song at a session, but anyway, I wasn't privileged to witness that. But in my experience, probably the exception to the rule, Adam, is maybe like the one example that I can give is like a Rolling Stones, where they rent a castle with a recording studio. And they live in the castle, and they write their songs while they're living in this environment and creating an entire concept album. And if anyone's ever read Keith Richards' book, it spells it out. And I'm sure that many musicians, including my ex-husband, he wasn't a musician, he was a producer, stayed in the studio with singer-songwriters for many hours with other musicians, and had a creative experience. Mine was an ensemble kind of situation.
Because you were working with, as you said, the Wrecking Crew musicians, which are the best at that time.
So to sum it up, I guess I was prepared.
Yeah. They
were prepared. Everyone was prepared. And when we came together, it just flowed.
Absolutely. It must, I'm wondering, because you're talking about, the longevity of a musician or a vocalist to be able to go in and do what they're doing for that long. Is it to work for 14 hours straight, that's got to be a strain on your voice at some point.
Well, I was, 17 years old. So basically, I was not used to singing for that many hours.
For sure.
No, not in a row. There were moments in between songs, where, of course, everybody goes to the potty. You get a glass of water or whatever. So there's a little bit of lag time in between, but not much, because you're paying for studio and musicians, and it's not an inexpensive proposition.
Absolutely.
Although that brings to mind, I can't even imagine. I don't think I was probably the only unpaid person there. When I think about it, when I think about the reality of that, but no, that's really, when you're in the studio, time is definitely money. And I do have. My first husband was recording Greg Allman, and he was famous for being very late.
Right.
And I recall my first husband telling me that he would be setting up in the studio. This was a Warner Brothers studio, and all the musicians would be there, and the engineer, and all this. The clock started, and about 40 minutes into it, no Greg.
Yeah.
So my first husband would, call him, "Where are you?" And Greg Allman would say, "I'm 1 foot out the door." And about 2 hours into a paid session, he would finally show up.
Wow.
And I don't know if Warner Brothers company was very pleased with that. That those kinds of situations are not to be taken advantage of.
Yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely. And certainly I know besides the musician's time and the studio time, ARP was very intent on doing a quick turnaround with these. There was a very quick turnaround to really get this all together and to, as Beach Party movie fans might know, often what would happen with the albums associated with the films is that usually one of the artists would get the opportunity to record the soundtrack album for it. So it wasn't as if each artist performed the song that they performed in the film. So for example, Annette, I think, would have got the Beach Party soundtrack. I think Frankie and Annette both did separate Muscle Beach Party soundtracks. You, of course, had your own single from that with Muscle Bustle. I think Candy Johnson got an album as well. But you were chosen essentially to get perhaps the best, the most well-known album, and certainly I would suggest what ultimately became the most well-known soundtrack of the Beach Party films, which was for Beach Blanket Bingo, working with your own producers at Capitol, who you had started with the year before, who were Dave Axelrod and, of course, Mr. Barnum as the arranger. So you were familiar with those two, having worked on some of your singles for Capitol as well. So I guess there was that familiarity.
Well, I definitely did some performance with H.B. Barnum in San Francisco at the Cow Palace because he would lead the orchestra.
Yeah.
At those big concerts.
I remember you saying that, absolutely. And to talk about, to get that all turned around, all those album tracks, as well as that beautiful cover of Beach Blanket Bingo, the album there.
Thank you.
So to return, I guess, just a little bit to the film, I think those visions of poor Annette, in the makeup chair covering up her extensive sunburn is something we're going to remember. But if we think about that scene that you set, as you said, it was your song was set in this mid-century space in front of a fireplace. Did you have any input into your costume, which this time was not a bathing suit as it had been in previous films?
By then, I think I was getting a reputation of, choosing my own wardrobe or, because of my commercials or whatever. Wardrobe people were trusting me, so that was my own wardrobe.
So that was something that you had actually chosen, or did you make any of that?
Oh no, no, it was something that I chose.
Great. And of course, we can also see a necklace, and that was a piece of your own property as well, wasn't it?
Well, that was a gift. That was a gift from my boyfriend Bob.
Yeah, who we've spoken about previously. So when you think of during the session for the album, given it's a 14-hour session, usually your adopted dad Maury was very close by as your manager on the films, although we've spoken about exceptions to that. Where was he in the studio during, basically this nighttime session?
Yeah. There's absolutely no photographic record of it. So I think that he was in the sound booth.
Yeah.
Not in the studio. And he was kept in his own little box, I imagine. Told not to interfere. I'm sure, I don't know. His personality, was quite selective, and but I wasn't privy to knowing, why he wasn't taking pictures of the session.
Yeah, it's interesting that you haven't seen, for all the pictures that he took as a photographer and, the hundreds and hundreds of slides that you've got, that there doesn't seem to be much or anything from that particular session. Yeah.
Like I say, he may have been told to just kind of stay out of the way, no cameras, no interference. And he had to cooperate. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of.
Do you think that maybe gave you a bit more freedom in the studio to work with your musicians and producer and arranger?
In one way, absolutely. It created a bit of equality, rather than alienating or isolating myself from the whole. We definitely started letting down a little bit more of whatever defenses after a few hours, and sure, it became performance art. And I think that shows up, a lot of vitality. Literally, I don't recall anyone, dragging themselves out of the studio at the end of that 14-hour period. I think that everyone was kind of charged up
Yeah.
and feeling good about it and left with smiles on their faces. So did I. I would say, though, that being a minor and my dad being responsible for me, there there was no talk about those kinds of restrictions.
Yeah. It's pretty
and
telling when you look at that sign in the studio, saying how long people should work for, and where you've blown that up by a few hours.
Yeah. Like, I can't do the math, but it seems like it's 3 or 4 times as much as you're supposed
You're
to.
asking the wrong person for the math, I'll tell you that much. But but I guess just to think about, because Beach Blanket being such an iconic film, your performance really tops a lot of people's list of their favorite moment in the film, amongst many great scenes with character actors like Paul Lynde or Harvey Lembeck, or of course Frankie and Ned and John Ashley and Debbie Wally. But when you think back to Beach Blanket Bingo, and particularly that it did give you what has become that song that you have that has stayed with you all these years, what do you think about it?
Oh, I'm happy to be associated with it. Initially, I wasn't sure, if it was just a B movie, just very slapstick and all these variety of everybody from Buster Keaton to to Don Rickles, I to Annette. I couldn't put it all together at the time, but I see how it affected our troops in Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was one of their favorite movies,
a very popular
to
film there.
remind them of home. And I don't know, it seems to be something that has enhanced my identity and my career, and so I'm grateful for that.
Fantastic. And we're going to switch gears a little bit now, because there was a lot going on at this time. There was the movie, there was the album, and I think to reflect that, you received an award of sorts. And this one's an interesting one, because you were treated to a night out when you became what was called at the time a Deb Star. So why don't we talk about becoming a Deb Star?
All righty. I will continue my read in Chapter 8, Shakin All Over. Usually, I was chaperoned by my dad. But when we received notice that I was chosen to be a Deb Star by the Clairol Hair Company, there was an exception to the rule. I was escorted by Paul Peterson. Somehow, my parents were convinced by William Morris to let Paul pick me up for this occasion. He arrived at my house on Grandview in a fire mist saddle, Cadillac Eldorado convertible. Wow! I was free to go with him? 10 starlets were chosen for a coming out ceremony, including Raquel Welch. I fit the profile of being the youngest, and she just got under the wire, being 24 at the time. 2 divas were special guests, Betty Davis and Gloria Swanson. This event was televised nationwide on ABC TV. Afterward, Paul detoured the route to my home by meeting his buddy, Tony Dow, from Leave It to Beaver, at a favorite hamburger place in Studio City. Tony was an escort to one of the recipients of this award as well. I remember still being in my gown and sitting on Paul's lap. Before he took me home, we drove to Truesdale Estates for a heart-to-heart talk. He could tell I was emotional. It was hard for me to understand why, but my raw feeling of just not having someone watching every move I made, freedom, threw me into overwhelm. Paul was a very good listener, and maybe his intention was to take me to see the submarine races, a common slang for making out, but instead, he only showed me compassion for a wounded bird, my metaphor for the way I was treated by my parents. I walked to my door with my little statue I received in hand. He opened my front door for me, gave me a reassuring hug, and said goodnight. Even though I had already been out of school for almost 2 years, a twist of fate allowed for me to experience my high school prom. Thank goodness for my friend Janice, who kept her word and made sure that Mr. Paney, the music teacher of our school's dance band, contacted me. Essentially, I became the entertainment for the evening. The question was, who would be my date? You'd think it would be my boyfriend, Bob, but the answer came when my Uncle Lou, Maury's brother, was dating a lady named Anne. She had an 18-year-old nephew who she wanted me to meet. Serendipitously, her nephew Jerry became my prom date. Corsage, the works. Jerry came dressed in a black suit that looked like Prada today. His hair was cut by Jay Sebring, a classic for our time in the early 60s. When we held hands in my living room for my dad to take a photo of us, I felt his hand shaking. This moment was recalled many years later when my prom date became my husband. The Deb Star Ball was exciting, and naturally going to my prom was memorable, but nothing compares to attending the Academy Awards. My friend Paul invited me the year My Fair Lady won Best Picture. He and I had already experienced the film at its premiere, and for this occasion, I designed a pale pink velvet dress for the night. It was a long gown empire style. The design I had decided on was difficult to make because I cut the back almost to my waist. To plunge it down, you need a certain kind of structure, which my mom and I figured out, but it was to the last minute that we were fiddling with getting the dress just right so I could leave. It was down to the wire when I looked out my window and saw Paul driving up, this time in his Cobra. This is par for the course. I'm an adrenaline type, so my process is usually last minute. I'm lucky that my mom took all the pins out before I had to walk the red carpet. Walking down the red carpet, I stayed close to Paul. Maybe it was the absence of a safety factor because I wasn't chaperoned by my dad. As I stood by his side, Paul spoke with Cary Grant, whom he had appeared with in the movie Houseboat. I also caught a glimpse of my professional namesake, Sophia Loren, his co-star in that movie. Soon, we were seated in the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, a venue which could hold 3,000 people. We were told at the beginning of the taping that we were no longer allowed to get up out of our seat for any reason for the duration of the show, even to go to the bathroom. Well, looking around at all the people seated during the show, I saw the defiant Betty Davis sneaking out to go to the bathroom after we were all told not to leave our seats. Throughout my career, Paul acted as an escort with me on many occasions. He had a public relations representative who set up lots of different things for us to do together. Sometimes it was a magazine article at the beach or a publicity photo with another one of our peers, such as Sally Field. Just the other day, we were exchanging New Year salutations. He reminded me that the only time he put the convertible top up on his Cobra was for me that night, so my hair wouldn't be disturbed. An unusually rare a professional date was arranged for me with Bobby Hatfield. Bobby called me directly, so there was no middleman involved. I guess there was a chemical attraction from when we sang our duet song on Shindig. Certainly, he knew I wasn't a party girl because my dad was always hovering around me. Maybe that was what attracted him. He was from Orange County, a wholesome bedroom community near Disneyland. I just thought how cool it was for a cast member to want to go out with me. I never had that chemistry with anyone else. Bobby had got wind of me presenting an award at the Grammys, and so took the opportunity to ask me to be his date for the evening. Bobby showed up at my house dressed in a tuxedo. There was a limo waiting outside. He had been to my house before with his partner Bill Medley for a teen magazine pictorial, and my parents knew him from the circuit of rock and roll TV shows we were on together for several years. They trusted him, and so did I. My mother had helped me make my dress, which was a formal A-line empire in cranberry satin, one of my favorite styles. But of course, it blew my mind again. My dad wasn't going with me, and there were no photos taken of me presenting an award at the Grammys, except for a press photo. Bobby and I arrived at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in enough time for me to be prepped for my lines. This was to be the first televised Grammy Award show. It was not considered high profile at the time, nothing like the Oscars. I remember executives in the music business saying to me, quote, "This will never last," unquote, meaning rock and roll. It appeared to me that the Grammy Awards came out of the pop music world, but certainly included every other musical category. If this business wasn't considered an industry, certainly a TV special handing out awards would be a simple production, and it was. I was given a list of names to read as nominees for Best Composer. When the assistant director asked me if I had any questions, I said no. What I should have said was, "Let me read you the names so we know I have it right," but I didn't. And it was time to announce who the nominees were. My co-presenter, Jonathan Winters, had no patience for me when out of my mouth came Miriam Maccabee instead of Makeba. Instantly, he joked, "Have you eaten your Wheaties today?" which completely distracted from my error. I had no knowledge at the time that Miriam was in exile from her native South Africa and an activist who would later in 1966 receive a Grammy for her musical efforts with Harry Belafonte. That night, the award went to Henry Mancini for the Pink Panther. Henry Mancini became a familiar face in my life, culminating in a project I did with him in Sedona, Arizona, to raise money for building an amphitheater. I produced a concert in 1984 and hired him to conduct the symphony in the region of northern Arizona. After the Grammys, Bobby and I attended an event at the Coconut Grove, a happening place at the time for formal dinner and entertainment. Wayne Newton appeared there often with his brother Jerry. I was guarded and maintained a reserved attitude that evening. Bobby never made it to first base with me because I was so preoccupied with the mistake I'd made, I couldn't just let it go and have fun. He respectfully escorted me home by my curfew of 12:30. I've always had a fondness for him. It saddens me to know that he's gone. Does a day ever go by without hearing Unchained Melody on the radio? Anne Margaret was to receive an award in Detroit for Most Promising New Female Star in Motion Pictures. Bill Cosby and I were the entertainment for the evening, and Leslie Caron, who co-starred with Gene Kelly in An American in Paris, was presenting Anne with the award. I opened with my old friend Bill Bailey, a real crowd pleaser. Mr. Cosby did his hilarious car routine. When the star of Bye Bye Birdie and Kitten with the Whip was announced by dancer extraordinaire Miss Caron, Anne Margaret sauntered onto the stage wearing a white satin negligee-style gown. Her red hair, now blonde, combined with her very smoky eye makeup and light frosty lipstick, gave a hard appearance, unlike the sweetheart beneath it all. She had taken on the persona of the role she played in Kitten with the Whip, often a characteristic of many great actors. On this night, she was honored, and so was I when she strutted her stuff at me. Yes, I was maybe 20 feet away, and she sunk into a jazz dance position and moved toward me singing, "Won't you come home, Bill Bailey?" Eye to eye, she sang to me as a compliment for my performance earlier that night. Anne's choice to relate in that way showed me how pure an entertainer she was and is. Her sensuality would have melted any man to a pool of pudding, but to another woman it was the supreme compliment. Thank you, Anne. The flight home to L.A. after the show presented another magical moment. Maury and I shared the first-class cabin with Ms. Caron, who disappeared into the restroom 30 minutes before we were to land at LAX. The fragrance of the most exquisite perfume wafted through the air behind closed doors. The seatbelt sign turned on, and she slipped out of her hideaway and into her seat just before we touched down. The doors opened, and she whooshed out. I followed closely, Maury at my side, now curious at what all the fuss was about. Up ahead, I caught an image of a stylish man leaning up against one of the pillars in the airport. One foot pressed up on the post, his head looking down as to gaze away from anyone who might recognize him. Then Leslie leapt into his arms, and they caressed. Her beau, Warren Beatty, was too enraptured to give a damn who was watching, as I and many departing passengers filed by. The heat coming from their embrace was enough to break into a blush at least. But, alas, they sped off to their own private world, the trail of her intoxicating French violet perfume leaving an indelible memory for me. Between Anne Margaret's sensuality and Leslie and Warren's rendezvous, this teenager was getting quite an education in the romantic arts. The word got out that my hobby was sewing. Of course, coming from a struggling middle-class post-World War II family, sewing was a necessity. My mother would make her own clothes as well as mine until I learned how to make them myself. Simplicity Pattern Company was looking for a celebrity who could sew, and I fit the bill. I literally had to sign a contract that I would sew each garment that I wore in the commercials. Simplicity flew me to New York to do the photography and filming for 5 days. Beforehand, I had received a package in the mail of fabric and patterns I was to construct. Part of my love of sewing came with deviating from the design and injecting my own ideas. With this project, the two fabrics were atypical of what one thinks of for early mid-1960s. Black and white, houndstooth, lightweight wool, and white nubby weave, lots of texture. Thank goodness it wasn't poodle wool. The first was to be made into a jumper, a very handy little garment that looks like a summer dress, but actually serves as another layer over a long-sleeve turtleneck sweater and tights. A great fall-winter look. The white nubby was made into a dress with very Jackie O sleeves, in fact, completely Jackie O. My mother assisted me minimally for fitting purposes. I was treated to a suite at the St. Moritz Hotel facing Central Park. Oh, those Monte Cristo sandwiches, Swiss cheese and turkey on white bread dipped in batter and fried like French toast and served with cranberry relish. Divine. I had to watch my waistline, so I usually ate half the sandwich with a glass of water. The highlight of this evening was being photographed by Francesco Scavallo. I think it's the best picture ever taken of me, even though photos taken by my dad were always considered first-rate. And what a thrill it was to receive a call from Grant Advertising telling my parents that my commercial for Simplicity was scheduled to be on during The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show? That was another occasion for which my curfew was lifted. Huddled in our tiny little living room around the old black and white Zenith TV, set in the corner of the room, my family and I patiently waited for my commercial to be shown. What a thrill.
Wow, what a lot of stuff to talk about. I don't even know where to begin other than to say you're probably one of the, I think we could count how many people in one hand made their own dresses for the Academy Awards.
You know, when you asked me about what I wore on Beach Boys with Bingo, you know, I generally made dresses, or, you know, sometimes I recall making pants, but mostly, you know, if I was wearing capris or shorts and a simple top, which is what I sang, It Only Hurts When I Cry, and they would be purchased. So, yes, I loved making dresses. I still do.
Absolutely. And of course, many years later, as some of our listeners would know, you know, this really became a very big part of your life. Just thinking about so many of those experiences, going to the Coconut Grove, which I'm sure listeners who went there have probably never forgotten, the Coconut Grove, where people would go to watch, late shows with people, like Wayne Newton, or, when you speak about Francesco Scavallo, who was, of course, really known for his covers on Cosmopolitan magazine and his portraits of, celebrities. I remember the picture of Sting, that, an iconic artist Francesco Scavallo was, and to be able to work with him as well, there's some pretty special experiences here.
Indeed. And quite memorable, thinking back in terms of, being a teenager, and under the circumstances, work was the priority. Earning money for my family was the priority. And all of these other benefits of meeting people was part of that equation.
Yeah.
And thinking back, it's almost like an invisible screen. Was when it's strictly work, it's hard to establish any kind of relationship other than the rapport that's absolutely necessary at the time.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to romanticize, although I do recall this wonderful lunch that Mr. Scavallo arranged, and being from Italy, the Italian way is having a long harvest table. Well, you know that.
Yes, absolutely. You start on Tuesday, you might be done by Thursday.
Hello, Lucy.
She wholeheartedly agrees.
He had a studio in New York with an area that was kind of reminiscent of the Cinecittà experience I had in Rome.
Yes.
Where there was a long harvest table, where a large group could gather. And he brought in a beautiful, I have no idea if he had it cooked for him or he had it brought in, but suddenly appeared this entire beautiful white fish. And how food is, that's the memory you think of, right?
Absolutely. The food, the smells, yeah, of course.
So I do recall having lunch with him, and that was delightful. It was brief because we were on schedule, and don't ask me why I was allowed to stay there for 5 days, but I guess in preparation and hair, makeup, just whatever it took to put it together. But it was essentially a 1-day shoot, and I loved the results.
Absolutely. And maybe I know there's a few sort of Polaroids of that session, and maybe down the track we can put them onto your Facebook or your social media to.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Unbelievable that Polaroids from 1960s, probably because he was a professional photographer and he knew what he was doing. But, I didn't take care of them that well. They were in like a scrapbook portfolio, but they are still in pristine condition. It's unbelievable.
Isn't that fantastic that they've managed to survive all those years? Because we tend to do that, don't we? We either stick them into boxes or books, or we stick them on with those old adhesive photo albums or whatever we do.
And you know what, Adam? That actually I lent one of them to an artist he goes by the name of Shag.
Yeah.
He does mid-century art. And he turned it into a silhouette that is part of my my little book.
Fantastic.
Pop 60s, right?
60s,
Pop 60s, yes.
Yeah. And that's fantastic because Shag's work is awesome, and it's very, it's a very loving tribute to 1960s mid-century type stuff. So, I do encourage our listeners to check that out. But I wanted to, just as we sort of get towards the end of our conversation today, just to go into a little bit about a point that you made where I was talking about all the experience of the Academy Awards or the Grammys or having that experience when Anne Margaret receives an award. They're obviously, special experiences from the point of view of what you got to experience. But you were making, I think, a really interesting point that they're not necessarily a nostalgic experience because, as we've spoken about before, not only were they work, but they were also, I think, very much coloured by the responsibility you felt in your career to support the family, which was the reality of the situation. Would you agree with that?
I really appreciate you bringing that point up. It's a point of contention that, you know, part of me felt obligated and part of me felt responsible and part of me enjoyed, you know, what I was doing because I loved to sing and it was fun making costumes and putting makeup and, you know, being creative and so forth. And then it was almost like this invisible screen that I never quite penetrated. You know, I was on one side and everything that was happening was on the other side.
Yeah.
Even though it looked like maybe I was singing out of the same microphone with Bobby Sherman or anybody else, you know, whatever contact that looked like there was some, you know, relationship going on, was very, very, I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but almost untouchable.
Yeah, it almost sounds as if you weren't quite while you were when you were singing, when you were engaged in that, you were in that present moment. But often it almost seems like perhaps you weren't in that present moment because there was so much else that sort of factored into what you were doing.
Yes, and actually, I have to compare it, you know, without getting too deep, into the political scene that has occurred in America in the last 4 years. And that is this veil of darkness that keeps an air of chaos and confusion. And I know we've spoken about this. In my own little bubble, you know, that is what was existing. That, you know, there was like a polarization, like a pull on me. And so when there is that, it's, to me, it's again, like I use that metaphor of an elephant that has a shackle on one leg. And when the shackle's taken off, they never forget. They always think that it's on. And that's kind of how it was for me. So I never really felt like the confusion that I had every time I was let out without parental supervision. You know, all of a sudden, who was making decisions that all of a sudden I was supposed to, you know, be with Paul and even though he was a good guy and Bobby Hatfield was a good guy, you know, it was very, very confusing emotionally to me after the way that I was raised, you know, being told I was going to be kidnapped or all the inconsistencies, you know, it's and I certainly didn't have the rebel in me to, at least yet, you know, to think, let's party, you know, let me try this, let me try that and get into a little trouble. No, it was always very perplexing and confounding for me.
I was going to say our listeners should stick around for subsequent episodes where you do go, what? No, I'm joking. But
I tried.
You tried, you know, and we will talk about that. But I think when I hone in on that idea that you've spoken about before, that when there's chaos and confusion in one's life, whether that's something that others are deliberately enacting or something where they're so chaotic and confused that they pass it on to the people around them, is that it then allows people to be much more easily controlled because...
That's right. It is a control mechanism. Yeah. Absolutely. And our past president was in that scheme of thought. You know, control mechanism, keep us in fear, keep the, you know, the voting contingency and whatever, the population in fear, chaos, and confusion, therefore equals control in his pocket.
And it's hard, isn't it, to even make a decision that... I remember I in a previous life was in a previous job and I felt very, very controlled in that job. And so when I started at a new job And I remember my boss asked me, he goes, what do you think of this? And I was just like, what do you mean, what do I think of this? I've never been asked that before. That's not my decision to make. But then I realized, wow, in a good situation, that is your decision to make. And so I think, a lot of us can probably relate to that, albeit, when you speak today about different experiences of going to different award shows and things like that, that ultimately a lot of the feelings I think many people can relate to, that are the same, regardless of the particulars of their situation. And I think with that in mind, I wanted to move to our mailbag corner, although I'd suggest our listeners use email, because if you try to mail us, in the old post, it may take 2 months to get to us, given the situation at the moment. But we opened up last week in our first episode of the season. We asked listeners to write in with questions about content that we spoke about in that episode, or anything that we speak about during this podcast. And we I would like to ask you a question from one of our listeners, Mike, who has asked a question I think that probably fits in quite well with what we're speaking about today, and will particularly fit in quite well in the future with some of our other discussion of music making, which is what we've done today. But Mike asked, do you feel that you were properly promoted and supported as an artist during your career?
Oh boy, that is an excellent question. And I want to thank Mike for sending an email. And I have to say that, first of all, in my life, it was maybe structured in a way that some can relate to, that at a very young age, given a responsibility that is quite overwhelming. And if there's no compliance, there could be a big price to pay. Mm. So in my case, with the responsibility and obligation that I had toward my parents, and them kind of focusing on me being the breadwinner in the family, it was compounded by the fact that, possibly touching on what you were saying before, Adam, about the control, that they really, they signed me to an agency, and that was 10%. But in terms of management, which is a greater percentage of income given away, Maury became my manager. That was the plan all along. Since I was 7 years old, and at 16, he became a full-time manager of mine. And before then, he had promoted me. He had practiced with me. He had taken me to auditions, and supported me in the ways that he knew how. Not being a musician himself, not being really in the theatrics, he was an assistant animator. Yeah,
he wasn't trained in this.
But I mean, he I guess he considered that show business.
Yeah.
That was the qualification. And he believed in me, to a degree, as long as I did things the way that he wanted me to. So to be supported, I never really felt that I was. I felt that, since I was a little girl, that if I didn't do things their way, both my parents, that there was a big price to pay.
Yeah.
And so if I was to give advice to a young person, for instance, like a Miley Cyrus, her father was very involved in her career. Maybe he wasn't any more qualified than my father. I don't know. But it definitely, I would say that when there's a family member involved that takes on, a responsibility like that for the career of another person, such as myself, that whatever they are not qualified to do, it is their responsibility to delegate, to those that can that can help that career along.
For sure.
which would put more money in their pocket eventually or ultimately, and be more of a cultivating experience for the artist, and to see what potential that person really has. So I would say that a lot of young people who have family involvement in their business are quite challenged.
Yeah, for sure. And it almost sounds like a lot of what was done, besides the lack of experience and not getting a experienced person in to help with that and to be part of a team, it also sounds like a lot of it was to, just do enough, for us to be able to, make that job or do that work or whatever else. But perhaps there wasn't that focus on longevity or, really building, as you said, really building you with those other skills that form a long career.
Yeah, to be fair, when I was 18, to answer Mike's question, when I was 18, my dad wanted me to play Las Vegas. Well, first of all, it would have been around alcohol.
Yeah.
And I never had to put up with that kind of an environment when I was performing. Never, ever. I never played a room, a club or anything like that where people were eating and drinking and otherwise occupied. They were always focused on the entertainment, whether they were seated or dancing. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm 18. Wait a minute. If there's alcohol involved, I should be 21. So when he said, I'm booking you in Las Vegas, I said, I really don't want to. I really don't want to do that. And he finally, Maury dropped it. And, there was no more pressure on that.
And that's, that says something. And I think there's a whole range of probably factors going on there, in terms of the age you were at that point and other factors. But I think the fact that he did do that when this is really something that you did not want to do, that was not an environment you wanted to be in, I think is a really interesting point to bring up. I think Mike's question has been a really fertile one for us to sort of speak about some of the issues that we speak about in the podcast, as well as what we're going to, I think, subsequently discuss. So thanks again to Mike for that email. And I just want to remind our listeners that we would love to hear from you about anything we've spoken about today or in any of our other episodes. And you can email us at podcast@donnaloren.net, and we will read some of those in subsequent episodes. And besides your emails, we'd love you to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. And we'd love you to leave a review on your favorite platform to tell us what you're thinking of the podcast, but also to help us to build our Love's a Secret Weapon community. So I think we've been talking for a while today on a range of topics. As usual, Donna, thank you for being so willing to be so honest with me and with the listeners about your experiences during this time.
Well, you bring out, hopefully you bring out the best in me.
Well, I hope so too. Unless anyone else says to the contrary, we're going to go with that. So.
We all have, this is a time on planet Earth for us all to evolve. And no matter, if you're a newborn baby or if you're a senior like me, and you're right smack in the middle, it's just a time for opening and expansion and getting to know yourself better and actually learning more about self-empowerment, since we have been taught so well disempowerment.
Yep. Absolutely. I think now, as you've said before, is really, while it's such a challenging time, hopefully it can be an exciting time. It'll still be a challenging time, but a time for growth and understanding ourselves and other people better.
Yes. And I think the real highlight of this decade is telling the truth.
And with that, we're going to leave you all. We thank you again for listening. And until next time, remember, love's a secret weapon.
Yes, love.